Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable discussion on building whole of government approaches to addressing gender-based violence, which takes place as part of the OECD event on government after shock. And this is an event that the OECD has organized to spur global dialogue on the implications of the current crisis on governments and also on how we can leverage this moment really to shape the future of the government for the better, building on the lessons that we've learned during the pandemic. And in this session in particular, we will reflect on the role of governments in addressing gender-based violence, which is a topic of profound importance for the OECD. But before we get started, I'd like to announce that we have launched a poll question for the audience. You can find this question via the chat function at the side of your screen, where there is a tab labeled polls. And we would invite you to share your responses as we will come back to the to this question during the discussion with our panelists. And then also please feel free to use the chat function on questions to share any questions you may have for the panelists. And then again, towards the end of the discussion, we'll select some of them and pose them to our panel. And there is also a discussion tab where you can post comments and interact with other participants and attendees of this event. And for those of you who are active on Twitter, I'd like to encourage you to use the hashtag GovAfterShock when tweeting about this session, but then also about the event more broadly. So now that this is all clear, let us get started. So by all measures, GBV, gender-based violence, GBV, also represents a global pandemic in itself. Even before the crisis, it was estimated that more than 1/3 of women experience some form of violence at least once in their lifetimes. And accordingly, GBV has become a priority area for the OECD agenda on gender equality. And for example, again, even before the pandemic, just before actually it started in February of this year, we held our high-level conference on ending violence against women, which brought together government leaders and stakeholders to discuss actions that we can collectively take to end intimate partner violence. In recent years, the OECD has also hosted global roundtables on access to justice, which aim to help advance survivor-centered approaches to promoting access to justice, also with a view to avoid re-victimization and to support greater reporting on GBV. We have also been developing a framework to help governments to strengthen governance and survivor-centered approaches to eliminating GBV. And actually it is in this context the OECD has launched a technical advisory group on GBV, which is made of policy experts, those that are joining me for today's discussions, but then also I know that many of them are in the audience. And the objective of this advisory group is to provide strategic and technical guidance to the OECD to advance this agenda. But since the onset of the pandemic, the OECD commitments to supporting countries to address, but then of course ultimately end GBV has only deepened. And this is because we all hear this in the news, the reports that among many other effects, the pandemic has exacerbated the GBV crisis worldwide. And even though it's a bit difficult to measure at this particular moment, what we see is that the reports from many OECD, but also many of our partner countries show that similar to the past health crisis, rates of GBV has significantly increased since the onset of COVID-19, especially during the periods of lockdowns when many women and girls had to be confined with their abusers. And while also many governments, and we'll hear some of the interesting and promising examples today, but while still many governments around our membership and partners have been taken action to respond to the GBV crisis, or what some have called a shadow pandemic, it has not been easy. And ultimately what the pandemic has demonstrated is that there is a need for governments to plan more strategically and to act more proactively when it comes to GBV, again, especially during the times of crisis. And with this in mind, we are fortunate to have three wonderful panelists with us today who will share experiences that they've had in responding to the GBV issues during the pandemic, and also who will share light on how their governments and other governments can use these moments to positively transform the ways in which we approach GBV challenge going forward. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sylvie Durrer, who is the director of the Swiss Federal Office for Gender Equality, which is located within the Federal Department of Home Affairs in Switzerland. Sylvie is also the vice president of the Swiss Conference of Equality Delegates and has chaired various commissions dealing with issues of domestic violence and equal pay. Next, we have Mr. Bert Groen, who is a former police inspector with more than 30 years of experience in criminal investigations, including on domestic and sexual violence. And beyond his police work, Bert has led several international projects focusing on developing and implementing multidisciplinary approaches to GBV and child abuse. And currently Bert is the president of the European Family Justice Center Alliance. And finally, we have Ms. Stefania Doebbel, who is the head of the International Affairs Department at the Ministry of Women and Gender Equality in Chile, and who has previously worked in South and Central America, Liberia, and Kosovo, advising governments, UN agencies, and NGOs on GBV, among other issues. So thank you all for joining us here today. And before we actually proceed with the discussion, let me just explain a little bit how today's session will work. So we'll start with some opening remarks by our distinguished panelists, during which they will share also some of the reflections on the actions that their governments have taken during crisis. Then we'll have a roundtable discussion which will consist of 2 rounds of questions which will be posed to each of the panelists. The first round will focus on the challenges and lessons learned, and the second round will primarily address opportunities and good practices on dealing with GBV also in the crisis situations. And then we'll pose a few questions from the audience to the panelists and close the session with a final question that each panelist will be invited to respond to. Thus, without any further ado, I'd like to invite our first panelist, Ms. Durrer, Dr. Durrer. Yes, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, first I would like to thank the OECD for organizing this very important discussion on how governments can adopt more integrated approaches. I also very much welcome the efforts of all organizations, including the Council of Europe and the United Nations, to include a gender perspective in governments' responses, especially in times of crisis. Indeed, one of the main risks in such a crisis situation, we are still within the shock, it is that gender equality is put aside. And today it seems clear that women have been disproportionately affected by this crisis in many ways. We are here to speak about a specific topic, which is gender-based violence and how to put an end to it. And in fact, what UN Women has called the pandemic, the shadow pandemic, you mentioned also this word, Tatyana, it's very important, is one of the most difficult issues to deal with for governments. Why? Because during a lockdown, it is very hard, if not impossible, to know precisely what happens at home. Because the victims, even more than usually, put up with the unbearable for fear of the perpetrator, but also for fear of bringing their families into even greater difficulties. Because also the victims think that domestic violence is no longer a priority for the authorities, and that services which counsel them, which support them, which protect them are closed. Because although they are afraid of getting sick if they go to a counseling center or a women's shelter. We will discuss government's responses to all these issues later, and I will in particular mention one of the Swiss responses, and it is a dedicated task force about violence and COVID. But I would like to underline right away the role of the media in Switzerland and in other countries, which have not forgotten the victims of domestic violence and which have sent us many questions and published quite a few articles on this issue. And I think it was a very important way to inform all people that domestic violence is still a priority for the governments. Researchers also have conducted various surveys on this topic and communicated widely their results. We just had such a survey in Switzerland. All these factors, as well, and all these actors, as well as the civil society, have contributed to help the authorities not to forget the issue and to bring light on the shadow pandemic, as you mentioned it. And I will further on a little bit develop what we have done, especially in the field of a task force, which is dedicated to this issue. But as I will stop here.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Durrer, also for reminding us about the crucial role that media, civil society, and then also research, data collection play in bringing light to this shadow pandemic, as UN Women put it. Now, let me turn to Mr. Groen, please.
Hello, I also want to thank you, the OECD, for the great work they are doing in this topic of gender-based violence, and also say hello to everybody who's listening and watching us. Yeah, what can I say more? I absolutely agree with what Sylvie said about the role of the governments, and I just want to go back to the before the pandemic, because what we know is that even before the pandemic, governments are still struggling with the approach of domestic violence and child abuse with gender-based violence. And there were already a lack of resources. There were already lack of efficient methodologies and programs. And the question already was how we tackle gender-based violence as effective as possible is an issue that governments are still struggling with. What we see is that beside car accidents, the domestic, the killings, the homicides, the murders, the deaths of women and also men and children are on the second place. It's that gives a good overview how worse, how severe domestic violence and gender-based violence is. What we have seen is that the pandemic has increased the pressure on governments. The consequences of the pandemic, local, regional lockdowns, have also further increased the pressure within the families. We know already that the risk factors like losing your job, financial insecurity, staying at home when you are not allowed to go outside and you are living with a violent partner are extremely big risk factors that contribute to partner violence. In almost all countries where we've seen, the first response when the COVID started was all kinds of measures, but forgetting about the victims, forgetting about the families. And I think, and that's what Sylvia addressed it also, that's a very important part that the government can take to address domestic violence still as it's there. They are not, that the victims and the survivors are not forgotten, that the risk factors are quite high. So I think that the role of the media is extremely important, that showing, and I saw it in my own country, the first weeks after the lockdowns, there was absolutely no, how do you say it, attention to domestic violence or child abuse. And it was all about lockdowns, about the economic consequences, but no word almost about the consequences for families and the consequences for the survivors. So I think that that's a very important lesson that, and we will talk later about that governments can take, address domestic violence, say that there are not, that you don't forget those people in vulnerable situations. And I think that's a very important part that we have to focus on.
Thank you. Thank you, Bert, for this intervention, and also really for bringing our attention to the fact that of the severity of the domestic violence crisis, and that the number of deaths that results from this crisis is comparable to only some of the biggest other accidents, and also the importance of not forgetting those who are in vulnerable situations, and also the other risk factors that can aggravate the situation of violence in the family, such as losing the income or losing a job. So all of this can have important influence on how people respond to the also lockdowns. So with this, now let me turn to Stefania. Yes, Stefania, please. We look forward to your reflections on the Chilean experience.
Thank you, Tatyana, and thank you, Sylvie and Bert. Just let me start by saying that I'm very honored to participate here today. I appreciate everyone who has logged into this roundtable discussion, and I would like also to highlight the important contributions that the OECD has been doing in the last month and year in terms of gender-based violence through the Working Party on Gender Mainstreaming and Governance, through the Technical Advisory Group and GBV. And Chile has been participating actively in these groups. And I'm very happy that we're also here in this discussion that will help us reflect on what countries have done and have learned after these very difficult months of the pandemic. Clearly, this crisis has come with great challenges. In Chile, we have witnessed huge increases in the demand for our GBV services. During the lockdowns, we saw a 250% increase in calls to our hotlines. But of course, this has also allowed us to identify the key bottlenecks within our response systems and work with urgency to really foster important innovations that will translate into much needed changes and improvement into the response as a whole, right? And I'm talking about leveraging technology and new tools to create new channels of communications with survivors, bringing justice closer to them, and working with new partners to instill the idea that really GBV needs to be addressed as a society-wide issue, and not only, as my predecessors were mentioning, not only tackled by the gender departments. It has proven then that really having a whole of government approach to GBV is crucial, and that for this it is indispensable that there is political will from the highest level. This requires, of course, sometimes internal activism and advocacy from parts of the gender departments in charge of GBV within the governments, especially in times of crisis when there are so many competing priorities, limited resources, and everyone is running against time. So I also wanted to, in this direction, mention that the technical advisory group of the OECD on GBV is finalizing an important framework that I think will be very important for countries to move towards strengthening a governance and survivor-centric approach to GBV. And I wanted to quickly mention the 3 pillars that the group is using that I think will help us not only guide this discussion, but will help countries really move towards strengthening the response as a whole. So the 3 pillars are having a systems approach to the problem, to GBV, with strong intersectoral coordination and holistic legislation and policies. Secondly, tackling the much needed cultural change to ensure survivor-centric responses that guarantees access to justice. And lastly, improving accountability. So I do think that this does a great job of summing up the main challenges that governments face to strengthen their response to GBV, and this will provide an important roadmap for countries to move forward and be better prepared for crisis. So I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say today, and to keep building collective knowledge together. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Stefania. Yes, of course, developing a systems approach and a whole of government approach has been among of the core priorities for the OECD in GBV, and it's also yes, great to hear that you found this to be an important dimension in developing your response to GBV in Chile. But actually, this is a nice segue to the discussion round, and the first question that I was hoping to ask Switzerland, Miss Durrer, because you've told us that as well as the pandemic highlighted that no single agency can deal with such complex issues as GBV, and it is in this context that Switzerland has set up a national task force to coordinate measures on domestic violence, but also on GBV more broadly during the pandemic. And could you tell us, based on your experience, and in particular because this task force was chaired by your office, by your institution, the Federal Office for Gender Equality. So what were some of the challenges that this task force faced in coordinating action? And then maybe what were some of the ways in which you dealt with those challenges? Talking about the whole of government approach here.
Thank you very much, Tatyana, for your questions. As you mentioned, the Swiss government reacted very quickly by establishing a national task force on violence, gender-based violence, and on domestic violence and COVID. It was launched as soon as the semi-lockdown was announced, so it was in March 2020. And the main goal of this task force was to ensure that counseling centers and shelters continue to provide their service and are able to function. It means that they have enough, for instance, means to be sure that they can respect the different barriers measures that we have adopted. It also, another main goal of this task force was to make sure that the police remain available for domestic violence and remain available to intervene at all times. And also that in case of violent incidents, the police continue to enforce restraining and protective orders, such as removing a violent person from a home. Also, if it was difficult, because it was difficult to find another place, but nevertheless, they were able to do it, and they would do it if necessary, or they would keep on reporting threats towards children to the relevant authorities. So it was very important. And in short, the aim was to ensure that victims of domestic violence, the great majority of whom women, as you know, have access to existing support structures across all regions and receive necessary assistance. Indeed, and it was said by Bert before, victims saw, and I said it also before, victims saw that support services were closed or that their case was no longer a priority in regard to health issues. And we had to overcome this feeling. So a very important point was to remind and make clear to all people that the fight against domestic violence remains a priority for the Swiss authorities, even in a pandemic situation. A challenge we face in Switzerland is also that it's a federal state. And so we had to make sure that at all levels, all local authorities would also be committed to fight domestic violence and to make sure that their own local structures would still function. So it was important to have different types of coordination, that we have a coordination between the different services, police, shelters for women, counseling centers, and so on, but also at all levels of our governmental organization. So it means between the national and the local authorities. And we had already before a committee, but this committee met three times per year. And then we decided, based on this committee, and it was so important that it still exists because it makes the whole thing very much easier. So we meet once a week. And so the committee with the police and so on, with all these people, we met once a week in order to make to see how the situation is. So, and all the different members had contact with the local authorities in order to see if we have an increase of cases, if we have problems by in some areas with the shelters because they don't have enough places, or because too many people are sick and they are not able to accept new person, and so on. So it was very important, and thanks to this committee, the task force could really work and make sure that we have the situation under control. And then what did this committee concretely? First, monitoring the situation. It was very important to do this. We needed to establish a short-term information flow to collect information, as I said, first on a weekly basis from all over the country. And the information we got came not only from all different kind of actors, as I said, from the police, from victim support services, from shelters for women, and other stakeholders which were in possession of information, which were very important for us. And we made also sure that we got information from all over Switzerland, from the urban areas as well as the sub-urban or rural areas. Second mission of this task force was to keep the population informed during the period of semi-confinement. In Switzerland, we didn't have, we had only semi-confinement. So we made sure that the population was informed that the structures function. To this purpose, we launched a poster campaign in a very short time with the help of different professional organizations, groceries organization, pharmacies organization, garden centers organization, and so on. And so they posted this poster in different places in Switzerland in order, again, to inform the population that domestic violence is, we have zero tolerance against domestic violence, and that people who need help are going to get this help. It was an important element, and it was quite interesting to see that these organizations, which were not specialized in domestic violence, they were eager to work with us. There was a sense of solidarity, which I would really like to recognize. Then, thirdly, we gave more financial support to different helplines. We thought that, as you mentioned, Stefania, there was an increase of demands on different helplines. And so we gave more financial support to different helplines in order to make it possible for them to answer all the calls they get. And then fourth, it is important that we know the numbers. And there we have a challenge, because in Switzerland, unlike different countries, you mentioned it, Stefania, you had an increase of cases. We had an increase of phone calls in different centers, but not always about domestic violence. It was about other issues. And in Switzerland, we cannot say nowadays that the number of cases of domestic violence reported by the police has generally increased. No, we cannot say this. Because also maybe we had only a semi-confinement, I don't know, but we don't observe such situation. We observe increase in different parts, but generally we don't observe an increase, and we cannot say at this point, but we must very carefully with this, we cannot say at this point that when there is an increase, it has to do with the situation of COVID. It can also be because we made more information in certain cases. We had also a social campaign on social medias. We targeted their young people and so on. So we made different information, and it can be that people dared to call the different centers in order to get more information, support, and so on. So we need more data, and it's a point I'm going to take again a little bit further on. In summary, for Switzerland, the principal aim has been also now in the current second wave to ensure that police intervention and reinforcement, as well as protection and support services, remain functioning. And so far we have succeeded, not least thanks to increased coordination and collaboration between the federal and cantonal levels, between the different services which are in charge of fighting domestic violence. But as I said, at this point, it's difficult to draw general conclusions as to the development of the cases and the overall situation. And we need more data, we need more analysis. We are getting some of this, but we have to be a little bit cautious. And in Switzerland, at least we cannot say we have really an increase in cases in domestic violence. At this point, we cannot have this kind of general statement.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvie. And indeed, the pandemic has put a lot of spotlight on the importance of data. But then what you really talked about, the importance of whole of society approach, not only whole of government, but genuinely a whole of society approach, but then coordination and collaboration across the levels of government, across government departments, across services. And actually this brings me to my question to Bert. Because Bert, you have been working as the president of the European Family Justice Center Alliance, and you work with family justice centers, which in fact aim to bring together different types of services that are necessary to support survivors of GBV, because we do know that GBV affects all dimensions of lives of survivors, be that access to healthcare, access to employment, housing, or justice. So in your experience, how has this service model worked or is working currently during also the second wave of pandemic? And what are some of the lessons that you think we can learn and that governments can also benefit from?
I'm pleased to share with you some good examples. And yes, absolutely, there are lessons learned for governments and that governments can benefit from. And I will focus more on the which lessons. But first, I want to share with you some good examples of the Family Justice Center model. And indeed, the Family Justice Center model is a model where professionals from different organizations, different occupations are working together under one roof and provide support and help to survivors of gender-based violence. And it's a very effective model. And we introduced this in Europe in about 6-7 years ago already. And it was originally launched in the US in 2002. in San Diego, where it started, the model, and it has shown to be a very effective model. And I can honestly say it saves lives, and I think that's a very important part of it. But what I want to share with you is an example that we had in Europe. In Antwerp, there is at this moment one of the best family justice centers in Europe. And what they had experienced directly after the start of the COVID-19 measures in Belgium, the Family Justice Center in Antwerp took over the coordination and changed within 1 week their regular way of working into a central and virtual coordination role for situations, imminent situations of domestic violence and child abuse. And what they learned was the existing operation and cooperation with the police, justice, administrative and social help centers within the FVC model they worked for many years about to develop that part, made it possible to organize this change to a virtual point very effective and very quickly. And what we see is that the already existing multidisciplinary approach formed a very good basis to switch to online consultations in the event of imminent escalating situation of domestic violence or child abuse, to create alternative housing options and concrete agreements with partners aligned to crisis measures. And to give you an example of how they did it, in Belgium, the government, within a very short time, they managed to get additional housing places. There was a hotel that opened because the hotels were closed in that time, and due to their short lines and also due to the commitment of the government, the Belgian government, they were able to create places in an hotel for survivors of domestic violence. So they hadn't, because there was a lack of space. Another thing that, and a very important result that was shown in the approach of in Belgium, was that there was a survey done by the Public Prosecutor Office in the Flemish part of Belgium, and what they saw is that the places where family justice centers were existing, there was an increase of the reports, and that's was and what we also showed that the survey showed is that in the places where there wasn't a family justice center model, there was a decrease of the numbers, and that's also what we saw in my own country, in the Netherlands, in the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis and all the measures. We thought the numbers would go up, but they stayed at the same balance, and even they get lower. So that was. And that survey that was done in Belgium showed that if you have a good model that's already working and has a good cooperation system with all, and police was a very important and is still a very important partner, that you can easily switch from the normal way of working to a virtual way of working. What we also learned, and that's I think the beauty of sharing together, is that we have a close cooperation with the Alliance for Hope International in the US. And they have a multiple family justice centers spread over the US. And because of the context we already have, we could easily share with each other the experience, because everybody, also in Europe, but also in the US, had the same problem. Was seeing the same things that we're struggling with. So we could easily share almost weekly the experience from other centers and give them back to others. So that's how you can learn from each other. And I think that is are very good examples how you can do that. And it's also what we learned is that the way of working for professionals in this new, let's say, reality is different than they used to do. Online consultations with survivors is very different. It's very difficult, and so there were you have also to work with to work more flexible, but also with creative solutions. And because we learned a lot from the consultations with the other family justice center with professionals as an alliance, the European Alliance, we were able to make very quickly all kinds of practical guidelines for professionals, but for professionals how to to work with to survive, how to reach out to survivors, but also for people working in schools, for people working in other support centers, but also for policymakers. So we share them on our website, and we saw that a lot of professionals use them because it's different. It's not the same. And to give you an example, how you can be creative, we have the how do you can say, I have to translate it into English, sidewalks conversations. So because professionals were not able to go to the houses for survivors to talk with them, but they managed to create sidewalk conversations or appointments, meetings at special places where you could meet. So I think that's the challenge that in Federal Justice Centers to work towards creative solutions. And what the lessons are learned for the governments is that, and we mentioned it already, is go public and make public that domestic violence, child abuse, sexual abuse never will be accepted. That the places where victims are able to go to are still open, that they're still there. I know that there were centers in the United States that put on their doors signs, but we are still open in spite of. And I think that's the role of the government is using the media and make it public, giving, by example, create a zero tolerance policy about in situations from domestic violence and child abuse, that because it's there and it's heavier. What we also have seen, and that's something that I want to share with you, is that not only the numbers increased, but also the severity of incidents increased. And what we see in the hospitals, that there was an increase of the severeness of incidents by children that were brought in with broken legs or with broken arms. And that's something that is quite new, that we see that not only the numbers are going up, but also the severeness is going up. So yeah, we can talk hours about it, but I think for governments, it's still so important to give the measure that they will never accept domestic violence, and that the police is still that's still one of the biggest priorities. And to end with the lesson learned for the governments, one of the things is that we're now talking about lockdowns and about a ban to go on the street in evenings or in the nights. We have to make an exception for the victims and the survivors. Because can you imagine that when you are in a situation of immediate violence and you go out in the evening, that you are captured by the police and you get a fine for being on the street? That's impossible. So as a government, give the signal and make it public that the ban for going out on the street during evenings or nights is not for victims of domestic violence, because that's, I think, a very strong message that you can give.
Yes, thank you, Bert. Indeed, many important lessons to be learned from your reflection. I just picked up maybe a couple on the importance of going public, bringing the sunlight to this issue, but then also flexibility, creativity in how we deliver services. That it's often not easy, and it requires new ways of thinking and new ways of working. And that's actually what this conference is all about. It's how can we really think out of the box and still respond to the needs and to another pandemic, which is GBV in this case, under the different circumstances. But then also something that you mentioned, which I think that is a nice bridge to the question that I wanted to pose to Chile, to Stefania, is that the importance of having good models of working, the importance of having good strategies in place which can then be adapted when the crisis hits. Actually, in this context, Stefania, I know that in Chile, the government adopted a contingency plan to deal with GBV crisis during the early stages of pandemic. And we also know that actually it's only one of the few governments that's done that. Could you maybe briefly share with us what this plan covered and also how did it work in practice? Again, if you could share some of the lessons learned also with regards to the development and implementation of this plan during a completely new situation and using new ways of working.
Thank you, Tatyana, and thank you, Bert, and for what you shared. That I think many of the things that we have done, I think, are of course very similar, trying to address the same situation across our very different cultures, but we all face the same. I think that something that was beneficial for Chile in a way and for Latin America is that we had a little bit of time to study and to see what was happening in other countries, and therefore to prepare a contingency plan with a little bit more time that we launched in March. And this plan, the main components were, of course, first, securing the continuity of our services and strengthening the GBV response capacity of our lines and centers and shelters. Going into quarantine, we had to make sure that the 109 GBV day centers that we have and 45 shelters for survivors were at full capacity, that we're operating at full capacity. We also needed to meet the increase in the demand that I mentioned before that really increased for our hotline. So we increased resources, we incorporated additional shifts for the hotline, provided the means to do remote attentions and appointment for the day centers, and expanded the capacity of the shelters. In terms of the coordination, of course, that was, it's always very important and it was a challenge, but we immediately activated the GBV coordination circuit that is composed by other government agencies, by health providers, the police forces, the public prosecutor's office. And as Bert was mentioning, this involved making sure that all GBV related services were declared essential, making sure that restraining orders and other protection measures were automatically extended, and working closely with the police and with the media to widespread the message that no woman would receive any sanctions when violating curfew or quarantine mobilization restrictions if she was seeking for help due to GBV. So that was very important. And of course, with securing these basic aspects, we also needed to make sure to address the new challenges. So this resulted in the development of new silent helplines. We opened a WhatsApp line, an online web chat, and an alliance with pharmacies for women who did not have access to a phone. That in the end, now that we are finishing, didn't go as well as we planned, because it required really training everyone who was receiving women in pharmacies, and so that was a bit costful in terms of resources. So we now transform it into an information place. So women can go to pharmacies to get information, but still the line to get in touch with GBV services is through the hotline or through the WhatsApp messages. And we're also developing now pilot for women to be able to set SMEs to our hotlines in case to reach the population that does not have smartphones. Another very important aspect was communication in an effort to, of course, make this a public health issue and not an issue of the Ministry of Women. We made sure that the information about our health channels was included in the COVID sanitary reports that were done daily on national TV, as well as to show our channel and the number that they could call on any news that was covering GBV cases. We also developed a series of media campaigns to promote our channels, to reinforce the message that preventing GBV is responsibility of everyone. So there was one campaign called "There is no place for violence in this community" that was done through municipalities and counties. Another one inviting people to do complaints on behalf of women that was called "Do It For Her." And along these, we also identified specific groups that were at a higher risk of GBV and sent targeted messages, guidelines, and information using key actors that could distribute information through these groups. And lastly, I would like to highlight the importance of instilling the idea that GBV needs to be tackled by society as a whole and needs to have a participatory approach. So on this line, we summoned a group of congresswomen and civil society representatives to create a council of women on COVID, where we came up with specific measures to address the differentiated impact of the pandemic on women on 3 areas. One was protection that covered health and GBV, and the other 2 were economic reactivation and care responsibilities. So we then developed a series of measures that were delivered to the president to hopefully move forward with that. And lastly, to reinforce also a territorial approach, we partnered with Banco Estado, that is the Chilean state-owned bank, to make information about GBV available on their large network of more than 30,000 local banking shops. They are basically in every corner of throughout the country. There's a little shop for banking procedures, and so now women can go there to receive information about GBV prevention. And we have also partnered with the private sector through business associations to make sure that they are also key actors in the prevention and detection of GBV among their employers, providing them with guidelines, protocols, and training on how to become active players. Just to close, as many of have mentioned already, I think the most important thing was that the pandemic has allowed us to identify where do we need to put the focus, right? And to allow us to move forward towards innovation, being creative, being flexible, and using technology and new tools to really get closer to women and making sure that the system is thought for them and with them at the center.
Yes, thank you, Stefania, also for stressing the role of innovation, also the role of learning and evaluation of our practices and our approaches, and the importance of adaptation and understanding what worked and maybe what didn't work as well as we were hoping to see. So all of these are really important. I also appreciated your feedback on the whole of society approach, but then linking back to the whole of government, because as we see, as we see in the responses to the poll question, one of the biggest, actually the biggest barrier to government's ability to respond to GBV during pandemic was seen as insufficient commitment and prioritization by governments of this issue. So how can we build that whole of government commitment and indeed mainstream GBV across all of the decision-making processes and cycles. Then many of you mentioned the importance of capacity, importance of resources, also for service providers, and this is yes, this was listed as kind of the second biggest barrier to kind of effective ability to tackle this this challenge. And then we have yes, the importance of a national strategy, comprehensive strategy, and coordination. So all of those issues that you have mentioned during your remarks. I see that there are quite a few really interesting questions coming in from the audience. So maybe, yes, we can go through the second round of questions, but I may ask, yes, each of you to, yes, to be extremely brief and punch in your answers so that we have an opportunity to, yes, to address at least some of the questions that are coming in. So, Dr. Durrer, Sylvie, based on your experience in Switzerland, which actions do you think that governments should consider, based also on what you've heard from other panelists and your own experience during the pandemic? So which actions should be considered to further improve coordination and the delivery of GBV services in Switzerland? And also, do you foresee any further changes, any improvements on the basis of what's happened?
Thank you. I think we should make an evaluation. I think it's important to go through the whole process to see what has to be improved. So it is a little bit too early to go into details, but nevertheless, I think we have seen how important it is to have a coordination mechanism in normal times. It was already said by my colleague panelists, but I think it's very important to emphasize this point. We need coordination mechanisms, and upon which we can quickly build in crisis times. Then, as far as Switzerland is concerned, we have to check whether we have all the right institutions and partners in the task force. As I said, we have the police department, the social department, we have the justice department. We also had very regularly contact with the statistical office and with the health office in order to check whether the data we get, whether the actions we are taken, whether they are the right ones, and so on, and in order to make sure that we don't forget a very important dimension. But we have to make sure that we have all very important partners in this task force. It's a work we have to still to do. Then I think an important point, we shall better ensure the link with other task force, because there were quite a few task force in order to deal with this issue, and there are still and we still have these task force. And I think very important that domestic violence task force is not alone on its side, that we have a very regular link with the other task force in order to make sure that the gender perspective, that the domestic violence perspective is also taken into consideration in the health task force, in the economic task force, and so on and so on. And then I think we shall collect also all interesting practices which were developed on a local level, and we need a kind of toolkit where we have all these, because we cannot say that one size fits all. So it's important to have all kinds of practices, and I thank you, Stefania and Bert, for your comments. I think we're going to get inspired by what you said, and we need also to stay very clearly, because as you said, so in Switzerland we didn't have we had only a semi-confinement, but nevertheless there were people who didn't dare to go out, and as you said, we have to state very clearly, if there is a domestic issue, people have the right and can go out and can seek help and so on. So there we need also to improve a little bit the situation in order to make sure that these messages, which seem to go per se, but nevertheless not the case in such situations, that all people know about it. Also, I think we need to have simple campaigns we can launch and relaunch every time. And I thank you also for your proposal, Stefania, when you said that every time you had press conference and a message on the part of the government in the on the TV, then there was this message about domestic violence with the numbers and so on. I think it's very important also to have this kind of practices, and they are going to inspire Switzerland. So thank you. A few comments, very brief.
Excellent, thank you, Sylvie. And now, Bert, going to your experiences. What we see in our work with many governments is that throughout the pandemic, it became clear that existing services are not always, or were not always, responsive to the needs and situations of survivors of violence. And you already talked to us about some of the examples to improve responsiveness, to also encourage victims of violence to go out, to declare these services as essential. But what else can governments do based on the initial lessons learned to further make these services more centered around the needs of survivors of violence? Because in some of the work that we were doing at the OECD, we were mapping the journey of a survivor of violence, and sometimes it's mind-blowing just to understand the number of transactions that must be taken in order to actually address this issue, just to say the least. So what can be done to improve centricity to the survivor needs?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I can be very short. Adapting the family justice center model, and that's, I'm not saying without a good reason. What I know is that governments they are always struggling with making choices, and I think that for a government it's very important to make a clear choice about the most how to implement the most effective approach of gender-based violence, and learn what already has to be proven to be successful. And I think if you looking in the world, there are good approaches, and the family justice center model is one of them. It's not, and Sylvie already said it. It's not one size fits it all. You have to make it work for each country, each region, each local community. We always use the phrase that the founder of the Family Justice Center model in the US always is using, taking the best what you already have and bring it together. And I think that's a lesson for a lot of governments. There already are great things developed. You don't have to develop things again and again. And I think that's a challenge for governments. Don't do that, because it takes a lot of time, a lot of discussions, but it takes sometimes years. So make choices, make clear choices. And I think also very important is listen to the survivors and use their experiences with the existing services, because we as professionals can do a lot of work. We have a lot of knowledge. The thing is, the survivors can tell us if we are doing the right or doing the wrong job. So I think that using focus groups for survivors, it helped us in the development of the Family Justice Center model in Europe enormously. The coordinators that from the municipalities that were participating, they used the focus groups, and they were astonished by the results, because we thought we were doing the right thing, but the focus groups, the survivors told us, no, it's not. And of course, everything is bad, but you can learn so much from them. So using and listening to survivors is I think, the key message that I'm giving to everybody, but also to government, and also for professionals. We are, as professionals, we have an attitude that we know what's best for you. We can, because we have learned that, and we have this. And no, ask the survivors, what do you need from me? How can I help you? Place the survivor in the middle. And I think, and that's also one of the most important guiding principles in our Family Justice Center model. And it's not about the name, because sometimes we know that the name Family Justice Center, people are a little bit scared of it. name it differently. That's absolutely not. It's not a protected name, but it's about the guiding principles that are behind it, and also as a government offering survivors of domestic violence and child abuse hope. Because and give them a perspective, because hope is the belief that your future will be better than today, and you have the power to do it. So we, as from the Alliance, are providing trainings for hope sessions, and hope is about setting goals and creating willpower and way power. But you can do it, and give survivors hope that there is a better future and that they can work on it. So, yeah, briefly, for governments, I would just want to say, make the best choice and don't think too long about it, because it's going on and going on. And it's not about the money, it's about people. It's about the people in vulnerable situations. And that's what we have to think about.
Yes, thank you, Bert, also for reminding us about the fundamental purpose of governments is to serve the people. And here, of course, yes, how to understand and listen to the needs of survivors, and then how to make best choices around those needs. And of course, yes, then the reflection is what are the best tools that governments have to do that, to respond to the needs of survivors. And then actually, Stefania, this would be my question to you, kind of a continuation of the previous discussion. So in terms of looking ahead, learning the lessons from the pandemic, and looking at the different tools that governments can have to respond to the needs of survivors, for your ministry, because we know that in Chile is one of the not many countries among the OECD membership that established a full ministry of women and gender equality. So for your ministry, and maybe for your minister, what are the priority actions? What are the priority tools that you put already in place during the pandemic? And you talked a little bit about some of them, but also, yes, looking into the future, what would you like to keep and what to expand, and maybe why? Briefly, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatyana. Well, basically, what I've been repeating throughout this session, right? I think the things that we want to definitely keep is the innovation and the new initiatives and new partnerships that we've built. I think that's critical and it's key moving forward. And some of these concrete things are the WhatsApp channel that I mentioned that didn't exist before the pandemic, and it was thought as a temporary measure. But we are definitely keeping that. It is an excellent way to communicate with women and to provide the security and privacy that they need when trying to communicate where they're living. Secondly, and again, in terms of innovation, the Public Prosecutor's Office also developed digital platforms to file GBV complaints and to extend protection measures, and also systems to provide online guidelines for victims that are going through GBV and that need help with filing these procedures. So that's definitely something that we are going to keep. And as for the next steps and things that we have identified and that are working on at the moment, one very important one is a project that we're doing with the World Bank that will identify the bottlenecks and gaps within the system, within the whole circuit of institutions and government agencies involved in GBV response and with women's access to justice. So this is aimed at improving coordination and moving towards a more survivor-centric approach. And as a result of this, we're hoping to develop a single registry or platform that unifies all the relevant information and data from survivors to also avoid secondary victimization. And I would also like to mention work, a project that we're doing with the Inter-American Development Bank that will leverage new tools as behavioral science to work with first respondents to GBV. So we will work with police forces, prosecutors, and the judiciary. And this will aim to create an intervention informed by behavioral insights to challenge preconceived ideas about gender and unconscious bias with these groups to try to improve their service delivery. And we are also working on strengthening our line of work regarding engaging with men and boys. We will develop a platform with online courses about positive masculinity that we all are developing with the Basque government. So I think that will be very important to strengthen that message that is also it's mainly the responsibility of men and boys to prevent and to not engage in any type of gender-based violence. And lastly, we are creating a platform that will also promote more awareness about gender-based violence across society. We will have courses, different information about the different types of violence. This will be called Chile Alerta, so sort of like Chile is aware, to sort of reinforce this message that we've been repeating many times today, that it is the responsibility of everyone to be active players in GBV detection and prevention.
Thank you, Stefania. And let me now really quickly turn to some of the questions that we've received from the audience. We have only a few minutes left in the panel, but let me maybe highlight 3 points, and then I'll invite every panelist to respond maybe for 1 minute. The first one is that it's important that GBV policies also account groups of women who are more likely to be subjected to violence, such as women with disabilities and migrant women. So with this in mind, what are some examples of measures, of GBV measures that take into consideration these intersectional identity factors, be that age, be that disability, be that migration status, etc. Second is the helplines that we discussed during this panel. Are they accessible to this different targets group? Is there, yes, are there examples which targeted specific groups of women, maybe during the pandemic, or yes, other victims of violence? And then maybe the final question is whether you feel, and maybe this one is more directed to Sylvie, whether you feel that the experience from the task force could be translated into a more permanent mechanism. But then, of course, the reflections from other panelists are most welcome. So now maybe let me go to Sylvie, and each of you, yes, 1 minute, please.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I think, as I said, we had a committee before which met 2 to 3 times per year, and then it was very easy to develop a task force, and I think it's something every country, every place could develop, and which had been proven very efficient. Then about the different groups. So as I said, we launched a poster campaign in 13 languages. And I think we need these elements. We should be available every time, and we can launch and relaunch when there is a crisis. Also, we have a national website for survivors. I'm going to try to use this wording. Thank you, Bert. And there also it is available in different languages and so on. And we made a social campaign, and there we reach about 1 million persons. So it was also very efficient to use this channel. Then we still can develop our national website in order to be more inclusive, as you mentioned, Bert and Stefania, and you too, Tatyana, and the people who are participating in this in this conference. So we are going to check this. Then another element I would like to emphasize, data. We need better data also in crisis situation in order to identify where we have to put our efforts, what groups we have to target and for which we have to develop measure, efficient and effective measures and so on. And there we have to make some, at least in Switzerland, it was very difficult to get really data which are very sound, very strong and reliable. And there we have to try to develop something in order to get the data in a very short term on which we can base our actions. And that's why, just a word, we are going to organize next October in Switzerland, United Nations World Data Forum, and there the gender statistics and the statistics about violence are going to be a very important element, because I think there we all have a challenge. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Sylvie. Bert, please.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that the family justice center models in Europe and also I know in the US are accessible for everybody, regardless age, migration background. They are accessible for everybody, and I think that's very important to know. And yeah, the lesson, and I can say it many times. The lesson we learn is listening to survivors. Absolutely, yeah. That's after the pandemic. What can you take from the pandemic is that we have to use the experiences, because we can learn a lot, and we try to do the best, but we can always do better. And I think that's the message I want to send to everybody, and especially to policymakers. Also use what's already has to be proven efficient and effective, and it doesn't have to cost that much. It's also about a mindset and showing that gender-based violence is extremely important to tackle with, and also send the message that you as a government will never abandon the survivors.
Thank you, Bert. And Stefania, anything that you'd like to add on either any of these questions or anything else looking forward that your government would like to keep from this pandemic, from the experience in this pandemic?
No, just to second what everyone is saying, definitely making available more channels, more different types of communication will allow us to reach different group of women. That's why, as I mentioned, we're working on developing an SME message, online chats, so that we can reach different groups of women in different parts of the country who may not have the same access as women, for example, living in cities. And just as I mentioned before, I think as Bert was mentioning, it is key that we listen to survivors and that we incorporate their inputs into the work that we're doing, that we do the necessary changes to be more inclusive and to have them at the center of all our responses.
Yes, well, thank you so much to our panelists. Unfortunately, this discussion, yes, has to end at this moment, but I really most sincerely wanted to thank you for sharing your experiences on what worked, but also what didn't work, and also what needs to be done better. What are the lessons for governments going forward? And I do think that we all agree in this panel that there was a lot of innovation, there was a lot of effort, there was a new ways of working, creativity during the pandemics and during the lockdowns in particular. But then there is so much more that needs to be done, and I won't even try to summarize what was discussed during this panel. Maybe some keywords that are coming to mind points is the importance of data, that we cannot develop evidence-based policy responses and measures without really understanding the situation of survivors, without understanding the pathways that survivors take to deal with their problems. Importance of listening to the people, putting people in the center of our responses, and also coordinating services, developing a whole of government, but also whole of society approach, fundamental role of media, fundamental role of civil society, also in putting the spotlight, bringing attention to this important issue. Of course, and this echoes the discussions in other parts of this conference, the importance of evaluation, the importance of continuous learning, exchange of good practices. What Bert said, that we often don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to put in place conditions for mutual learning and exchange and improvement as well. Yes, also having sufficient capacities and resources, because sometimes and often actually, even with best will, when limited capacities are impeding governments to provide, and also civil society to provide effective and survivor-centered responses, then all of our efforts can only go so far. So thank you so much. We will be preparing a summary from this session. We'll be sharing it with all of the participants. On our side, I also would like to thank all of the attendees to this session on the other side of the screen for joining, for your really provocative but also important questions, and we look forward to continuing discussion on this important topic. And I also would like to encourage the audience to join other sessions that are taking place this afternoon as as part of the government aftershock event, and yes, the outputs from these discussions will be available on the website of the government aftershock event in the coming days. So thank you so much, and we will look forward